Hi friends, I hope you're fine and doing great. In this video, I'd like to tell you a little bit about teacher's talk. Well, language teachers, including English language teachers, are often good at speaking. And they enjoy speaking in the class. They have a tendency to speak a lot in the class because they believe that speaking is a way of helping their learners learn the language. Well, this is partly right, but there are also disadvantages to excessive teacher's talk, and we're going to explore some of these disadvantages. Of course, there are some advantages to teacher's talk as well. If this is controlled, then it can be beneficial for the learners, but if it's not controlled, it can actually have counter effects. So we're going to look at teacher's talk both from its positive and negative sides, and we're going to see how we can actually control teacher's talk in the class. Well, we know that in communicative language courses, it's very important for students to have plenty of exercise, plenty of speaking practice. If we want to help our students become better communicators, we should give them opportunities for speaking in the class and for meaningful interaction, especially if our students are in an EFL context where students do not have a lot of exposure to language, at least for practicing the speaking outside classroom. So it's really very important to reduce teachers' talking time in EFL context so that we would give students more time of speaking and communication practice in the classroom. But what are some of the advantages of teacher's talk? Well, we need to distinguish between two types of teacher's talk. We have quality instruction time and irrelevant teacher's talk. Of course, when we're talking about teacher's talk, we're talking about quality instruction time because my assumption is teachers actually refrain from sharing irrelevant information with their learners when what they say isn't actually going to help learners in any way. That thing shouldn't actually be shared with the learners. To give you an example, sometimes someone may say something in the class and the teacher might pick on that and then start an irrelevant discussion in the class, which would actually take students' attention away, and students would actually lose concentration on what they've been studying because what they're discussing isn't actually related to the plan of that session. So speaking of teacher's talk, we're talking about anything which is related to the lesson and anything that can help learners learn the lesson more effectively. We're not talking about things that teachers might share with the learners just because they think they're interesting, but actually students do not find them interesting or they do not find them relevant to the lesson or of any use. Well, teacher's talk isn't always bad. If teachers use teacher's talk as a way of giving students information related to the lesson they're teaching, it could be used to the benefit of the learners. Imagine you want to give your students an activity where they would focus on certain grammatical structures, or you've prepared a text, you're going to read it out to your learners because you've compiled it yourself, and in that text you've used certain expressions, certain vocabulary items, certain grammatical structures. Well, you need to verbalize it in the class, right? So you give students certain questions first, and then you ask learners to listen to you as you're telling them a story or as you're explaining something, and then students need to do things with what you're sharing with them. Like they need to listen to your story, and then they need to answer certain questions or fill in the blanks because you've given them a handout. In this case, teacher's talk is a useful thing. Or sometimes you give students a pair work, a group work, and then you ask follow-up questions. Again, this is teacher's talk, but that is useful for the learners because you're actually engaging in natural conversation with the learners and you're asking questions related to the lesson, related to what they've shared with their friends after a pair work, after a group work, and those follow-up questions can be useful. So this is also a positive aspect of using teacher's talk in the class. But what are some of the negative aspects of teacher's talk, and why is it recommended that in communicative language classes teachers try to reduce their talking time? Well, one of the reasons is because teacher's talk reduces students' quality talking time in the class. Well, imagine you're teaching a class of 10 learners and you're teaching a 60-minute lesson. If you are going to explain things, give instructions and set activities in the class, so you're going to say, take 30 minutes of the class time, students will only have 30 minutes for speaking. And It's not just 30 minutes per speaking, actually, because they might have a reading lesson, they might have a listening lesson. They'll only have 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes per speaking. And if there are 10 learners in the class, and if you divide 20 minutes in between these learners, you'll see that each of them will only have 2 minutes per speaking. So teachers' talking time will considerably lower students' talking time. Of course, I'm going to give you some tips as how to reduce teachers' talking time and how to increase students' talking time. But for now, this is one of the disadvantages. And if each student feels like there is only 2 minutes for me to speak in the class, he or she's going to feel, not quite satisfied with the amount of practice they get in a speaking class. The second disadvantage could be related to over-explaining things. When teachers engage in a lot of speaking, this probably means that they're explaining things a lot and that they're giving a lot of information to learners. Well, we know explaining things a lot actually deprives students of the practice of discovering things for themselves. It's one thing to explain things, it's another thing to understand what the teacher explains. Learners don't learn what teachers teach. We need to, give the opportunity to learners to discover things for themselves. Well, explanation is important, but you need to also give students the opportunity to explore the language and to learn things by themselves, because if they don't do it, what you're sharing with them may be forgotten. Meaningful learning requires learners making connection with what they already know and with things you're sharing with them. So students need to work on the input you're giving them in order to internalize it and in order to retain it for a longer time. So if you just want to explain, it means you're giving them a lot of information instead of giving them the opportunity to process the information, to practice with the input you've given them in order to internalize it. And much of what you're giving them is actually forgotten, because students do not get all the information teachers share with them, no matter how carefully and how completely they explain things. So instead of explaining things, which means engaging a lot of teachers' talk, we can keep this to the minimum and increase students' interaction time, practice time, so they would do a little bit of practice in order to make that teacher's input their own intake. Another disadvantage of excessive teachers' talk is making class a little boring for the learners. Well, some learners actually sign off after listening to the teacher's explanation for a long time. Students need to have pair works, they need to have group works so that they don't feel tired in the class. When teachers explain things a lot, when they give a lot of information to learners, when students are rather listeners, recipients of information, than participants in interactions, they get tired, and as a result, they don't learn quite effectively. So it's best to keep our teachers' talk to the minimum. But what are some of the techniques we can use as teachers to keep this to the minimum level? Well, my first suggestion is replacing explanation with elicitation. When we ask learners questions, we encourage them to speak. But when we explain things, we encourage them to keep quiet and listen to us. Well, the best thing we can do as teachers is to minimize our explanations and then ask a lot of questions, carefully planned questions, so students engage in a lot of speaking. We listen to them, and we again ask other questions, and we encourage them to talk more. And this way, we make the class more interactive and less boring for the learners. Another thing we can do is to give a lot of pair works and group works to our students. This way, if you have allocated 15 minutes of your 60-minute class time, let's say, to students speaking, all the students in the class will have 15 minutes for speaking. But if you just want to give individuals a few seconds to speak in each activity you're giving them, totally they won't have more than 2 or 3 minutes of class time to speak. So it's much better to give pair works and group works to students. Let's say 3 minutes pair works, 5-minute group works or more. And if you have a number of these, activities, students on the whole will have like 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Each individual will have some 15 to 20 minutes of speaking practice. And that makes the individual feel like he or she has had a lot of time in the class in that session to practice speaking, which is really very nice. And my third tip is using visuals instead of explaining things verbally. Pictures, posters, short video clips can save us a lot of time, because when you're teaching something through visualization, whenever possible, of course, you won't have to engage in a lot of explanation, talking, giving examples, and so on. And not only does this make the lesson more interesting for the learners, but also students will get the point in a shorter time, and you won't have to explain things in order to increase your talking time. So with practicing minimizing teachers' talking time, we're in fact improving students' speaking through increasing their speaking opportunities and interaction level.